Gold fever. As Rip Campbell came out of the Eldorado Hotel, that midnight, he could feel almost with a physical impact the pulsing, feverish excitement of this gold-mad shack town that had swelled and burst at the seams and become a brawling, sprawling city of nearly 15,000 people. He stood there for a moment, getting his bearings, letting the pushing, jostling street crowds swirl around him. He had once been a big, powerfully built man, this Rip Campbell, but the malaria he'd contracted, crossing the isthmus, had thinned him down to a wolf-like gauntness. It had hollowed his cheeks and dulled his eyes to flat gray. His hard-hewn, craggy features had always held a tough and raffish look, but the long death fight with the fever and the hellish trip up the Pacific coast in the packed hold of a ship, had increased it 1,000-fold. In the crowd that swept around Rip, a couple of bearded, burly prospectors, freshened from the gold fields, bleary-eyed drunk and hunting trouble, tried to shoulder him out of the way. Rip set his legs apart and held his ground. Both men stopped, hunched their shoulders and balled their fists at their sides, started to cuss him out. But slowly, the oaths stopped tumbling from their loose lips as they saw the cast of Rip's jaw, the flat, steel-gray coldness of his stare. They took in the hugeness of his bony frame, obvious even under the loose-hanging corduroy jacket and whipcord breeches tucked into the tops of black boots. One of the prospectors grabbed the elbow of the other and, mumbling some inarticulate apology, steered around Rip and melted into the crowd as it moved on. Rip took a deep breath, hitched at the gun belt with the empty holsters hanging from it, that was draped around his lean hips, and pushed down street into the crowd. Slowly, the feverish excitement of the city began to blend with the strange inner excitement that had been mounting inside Rip, from the moment he'd checked into the hotel, and boiled to a head. He quickened his long stride, and in a few moments he was stepping up onto the stoop of a great, barn-like building with a sign over the front that said in man-high letters, Queen Bea's Place. He swung on one side for a moment at the bat wings suddenly flung open, and two gorilla-shouldered bouncers gave the grand heave-ho to a cursing, drunken bullwhacker. The bouncers brushed off their hands and gave Rip a suspicious once-over with their cold, hard eyes. Rip held their gaze, evenly, and pushed between them into the saloon. A great burst of sound struck his ears, a cacophony of noises, roaring laughter, the giggling and squealing hostesses and percentage girls, the clicking of poker chips and the clinking of hundreds of glasses, the off-key tiny tempo of a jig-time piano tune, men's voices raised in drunken song. Rip's eyes swept a quick appraising glance through the dense fog of smoke that hung under the flickering light of a bent and twisted second-hand crystal chandelier. From the time he was a kid, Rip Campbell had been raised and brought up and worked in combination gaming casinos and saloons like this. He'd seen them up and down the East Coast, in riverfront towns along the Mississippi and the Big Muddy. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. Avant-Garde's place was the center, the rotten core and heart of the gold fields, even though the nearest panning and sluicing and digging took place miles away. It was here that the dust and nuggets came first to be doubled or trebled, or lost. Rip could almost feel the thump and throb of the gold rush fever in this place. The lid had burst right off, at Avant-Garde's. The lust for money and more money was wide open and raw and exposed, there were no pretenses. Rip saw men at the green-topped poker tables, at the roulette and Monte and faro layouts, jam-packed together, fighting each other for the chance to risk the poke of yellow dust that they'd sweated and slaved, and sometimes killed, to acquire. He saw the girls who worked for Avant-Garde, yanking hair and clawing with carmine nails at each other, to sell their favors for a spilling of the dusty yellow wealth from some newly duded-up miner fresh in from his diggings. And then in turn, rush to one of the gaming layouts, to either lose or add to their newly acquired stake. Fortunes large and small, constantly changed hands within a few hours. And as Rip's flat, gray gaze moved around, it found the balcony that ran along the side and back of Avant-Garde's place. It found the great fat, female Buddha of a woman who was at the vortex of this sucking whirlpool of gold, into whose safe it all eventually found its way. She was standing on the balcony, leaning over the rail, looking down on the gold-crazed confusion below. Wendy Markham was taller and heavier than most men. She wore a silver sequined evening gown, her massive, meaty arms and shoulders powdered a sickly white. About the layers of fat where her several chins joined her fleshy throat, diamond chokers winked in the dull light. Her hair, dyed a blinding orange-red, was piled high in a stylish pompadour, crowned with an emerald-studded tiara. From each plump, pale finger, a different jewel flashed its own glitter, and she held a long, solid gold cigarette holder to brightly painted Cupid doll lips and sucked in smoke and let it trail out again through her thick, flat nostrils. Wendy Markham's eyes were like little pinpoints of icy blue light flashing out from the sooty pouches of flesh above and below them. The highly arched, thin black lines of her penciled brows gave her whole fat, evil face an incongruous look of pseudo-surprise and innocence. Those eyes constantly watched the action on the main floor of the saloon and gaming casino, below. They saw, now, a huge, red-bearded seaman off a slave ship, grappling with one of Wendy's girls, in a booth almost below the proprietress. He had his hands around the girl's throat and was throttling her. Lazily, Wendy Markham reached to a table next to her and picked up a heavy silver urn full of flowers. She lifted it over the railing and dropped it, flowers and all, down upon the head of the obstreperous seaman below. The girl backed off, as the seaman fell unconscious to the floor, clutching her thin throat and looking up at Wendy and then scuttling off toward a curtained doorway in the rear. It was right after this that Rip Campbell saw Wendy's roving glance catch him, standing near the doorway, pass on and stop and come shifting quickly back and stay there. Swiftly, before her glance could pass on, Rip reached down to his empty twin holsters, unhooked the gun belt and slipped it off of his waist. He stood there, holding the belt and empty holsters in his hand, looking up from under his brows at the fat woman on the balcony. He felt sweat break out along the small of her back and under his arms and trickle coldly along his ribs. He felt the pulses in his wrists and temples throbbing, and for a moment, it seemed his heart stopped. This was the moment he'd been waiting for so long. This could mean nothing, or everything, as the result of a trek of thousands of miles. This was the sign he was making, which would bring about either the final fulfillment or failure of his desperate mission. If the woman didn't pick up his sign, if she turned away. She turned away. She spun surprisingly quickly for a woman of her bulk, on her high heels, without another look down, away from the balcony railing, and disappeared in the shadows at the back of the balcony. Rip felt his big bony fever-ravaged slacken and slump in despair. His heart started in again, but with a slow, measured beat of dejection. The sweat began to go cool and clammy under his shirt, and a slight shivering that wasn't entirely from the remains of the malaria still within him, took him. "Oh, Lord," he mumbled half aloud. "It's no good. It was all just a story. A sick, dying man's mad raving. It didn't mean a thing. I've come all this way, gone through all that hell for nothing. Now I'll never find the golden guns of Rebel." He swung the gun belt and empty holsters back around his lean waist and under the tails of his jacket and pushed through the mob toward the hands of perfume-reeking hostesses. He made it to the bar and pushed his way in. He downed 3 straight shots of rotgut that seemed to burn a hole right through his belly. And then he straightened himself up, shaking himself a little, like a great shaggy wolf that's been wounded and beaten but not downed. He was on his way from the bar, back out through the crowds toward the batwings, when a pair of slim hands that wouldn't be shaken off, touched his sleeves. A voice that was not whining and suggestive and wheedling crept into his ears. It was not begging him to buy a drink or a turn at the wheels of chance for its owner. It was saying simply, "Listen to me, mister. I keep telling you, the avant-garde wants to see you. Her word is law, here. You refuse and you'll never get out of those batwings alive." He stopped, and as her words sunk in, the excitement came beating like a bat's wings, back into his brain again. He turned to the girl who had approached him with the message. With a little surprise, he saw that she was not dressed in a sketchy, flashy evening gown like the other girls in the lace. She wore a simple black crushed linen suit. She wore no makeup, nor needed none. The fresh brightness of her black eyes, cheeks and the mouth, red and sweet as a dew-kissed rose, were enough. Her hair was a shiny chestnut color, pulled back flat and tight from a white, straight center part. From behind her small, perfectly formed ears, her hair tumbled about her shoulders in thick, soft coils. "I'm a stranger here," Rip told the girl. "Reckon there must be some mistake. Nobody here would want any business with me." The girl pursed her lips impatiently, her black eyes trying not to waver before the direct, admiring look in his. "Please don't argue. Come with me. The lady doesn't like to be kept waiting. Come, Rip Campbell." His shaggy eyebrows raised. "You know my name?" "Of course. She's been waiting for you, nearly a year. Every night she stands for hours on that balcony, waiting for you, watching for you. Come." He permitted her small, capable-looking hands to tug his sleeve, to lead him through the crowd, toward the rear of the saloon. "Who are you?" he asked. "Lily Bell. I work for Miss Markham." Rip gestured to a painted-up blonde girl, with her head thrown back, laughing, as she struggled between 2 husky, cursing mule skinners, each trying to maul her sway from the other. "So does she," Rip said, with a wry grin. He saw Lily Bell stiffen and raise her chin, haughtily. Her eyes flashed the fire of temper at him. "I ought to slap you for that," she said. "I'm Miss Markham's private secretary. I take care of her accounts." Rip didn't have a chance to speak again as they came to a stairwell and Lily lifted her skirts above slender ankles and flew up the steps ahead of him. At the top, she turned down a dimly lit corridor, walking primly on hurried short steps, in front of him, not turning back nor giving him another chance to converse with her. She came to a door at the far end of the hallway and stood to one side. "Please enter," she said. Rip stepped past Lily Bell and into a room that was crowded with a huge, roll-topped desk, a mammoth safe and the tremendous bulk of Wendy Markham, herself. She was sitting at the desk, a great expanse of her fat, powdered white back showing the thin straps of the evening gown cutting into the flesh of her shoulders, the emerald tiara glittering in the light from an oil lamp on the desk. "Sit down, Rip Campbell, and make yourself tommy," a rumbling, almost masculine voice bade him. "You're a little late." He heard the door of the office slam behind him and moved toward a rickety-looking straight chair against the wall opposite the safe. He jackknifed his long, rangy body down onto the chair, his fingers clenching and unclenching on his lap. "Yeah," he said. "I was delayed a mite. I had some trouble." "Oh?" Wendy Markham said. "Where is Humphrey Palm?" 6 feet under the rotting muck of the Panamanian jungles. Before he kicked the traces, Humphrey said to give you his love." The big woman, still bent over her desk, without turning to face her caller, swore in a low rumble, running the words all together, professionally. "The dirty little bull-legged stinker." She finished up. She turned then, quickly trying to keep Rip from seeing it, and dashed moisture away from her fat-buried eyes with one jeweled hand. They sat there for a moment, staring at each other, sizing each other up, and Rip couldn't help marveling to himself at this whole fantastic deal. He kept remembering gnarled and bull-legged little Humphrey Palm, his wizened little face yellowed and wasted with the final ravages of the fever, lying on a cot in a stinking tropical hut. Humphrey's eyes burned up at Rip as he whispered, "You won't believe it, mister, when you see the avant-garde. You won't believe that a mountain of a woman like her could ever have anything to do with a dried-up little shrimp like himself." Humphrey had been right. It was hard to believe that they had been man and wife. Wendy Markham could have picked up the little prospector with one fat pinky and slung him over the moon. "How come the little sluice rat picked on you?" Wendy Markham demanded suddenly. "Where did you meet him? How did you get to know him?" Rip took a deep breath. "It's a long story," he told her. "I'll try to cover up in a hurry. You know how it is on the isthmus, with all the riffraff from the Atlantic side crowding across to board a ship to come up here and all the newly rich and beaten or fagged out from the Pacific side pushing their way back to the Atlantic to come home. The mad trading of mining equipment. There was almost as much dinero to be made there as here. I'm a gambler, ma'am, by trade. I was on my way here when I saw that it wasn't necessary to go any farther than the isthmus to get my share of the gold." The big woman chuckled and nodded her head until the waddle of fat around her neck jiggled. Go on, she urged. "I worked in a place called Lazy Lou's," Rip continued. "It was only a hole in the wall, compared to what you have here. But the pickings were good for a man with a deck of cards and a set of fast fingers and sharp eyes. Don't get me wrong, ma'am, I'm no sharper. I win honestly, or I don't win at all. Anyhow, one night I spotted a bull-legged little weather-beaten oldster getting taken over in a game of Red Dog by a group of sharpers. I felt sorry for the little old codger, and the way they were cheating hell out of him was brutal. I reckon I was a fool, but I had to stick my nose into the game. I saved Humphrey Palm's money for him, and later, when the gunplay started, his life. In the excitement, he disappeared, and I didn't see him again for several months. I'd practically forgotten about him. Then I got a message to go out to a jungle village, and I found Humphrey there, dying of malaria." He watched Wendy Markham knuckle her eyes again, her full, painted lips tight against her teeth. He went on, "Humphrey was grateful to me for what I had done for him that night in Lazy Lou's, so he told me the yarn of Rebel's golden guns. It sounded pretty fantastic, and right up until I got your message downstairs, I'd figured myself to be on a fool's errand. But when you spotted me, sent for me, I began to feel that there was something to the story. Where are the guns?" Wendy Markham chuckled a little. She fitted a long white, Russian cigarette into her gold holder, inhaled deeply, and blew out a rolling cloud of blue smoke. "Talking through it," she said, "there's a chance you're not the right man, not the real Rip that Humphrey sent me the message about. Other men could answer your description, could have learned part of the story somewhere and come in here tonight, like you did, with empty holsters, hoping to pry the whole story out of me. You tell me the yarn as Humphrey told it to you, Rip. If it's complete, Then I'll know you're the right hombre, and I won't be giving anything away or making any mistake." So he did that. Swiftly, he repeated the wild yarn old Humphrey Palm had related to him. It had begun shortly after the first discovery of gold at Captain Sutter's mill. Humphrey Palm had been out here, prospecting before that, and was one of the first to make a big strike, along with his partner, a man who, because of the devil-like cast to his long thin features, had been nicknamed Rebel Hawks. After the first excitement had worn off, the two lucky prospectors had worked their diggings at the end of an isolated canyon to the limit. The biggest part of their newly acquired wealth, they had then buried where nobody else could ever possibly find it. With the rest, they were going to Frisco to have a good time. The idea was to make sure that they didn't lose or throw away the whole of their fortune. To make certain that neither partner double-crossed the other one, and that nobody else would be able to find the buried treasure, Humphrey Palm and Rebel Hawks cooked up the following plan. In New Orleans, Rebel Hawks had once purchased a pair of hand-tooled 6 guns with gold-plated grips. They were his pride and joy. It was he who had decided that these guns would hold the secret of the buried gold. So the two prospectors had drawn up a map, torn it in half, and hidden each half in one of the guns. The map was drawn up so that neither part was any good without the other. Then Rebel Hawks had given one of the guns to Humphrey Palm. A few days later, in Frisco, Rebel Hawks had disappeared. Humphrey waited for him to come back so they could return for the gold, but he never saw Rebel again. Meanwhile, Humphrey had settled in the city and married the woman who called herself E.A. Markham, who ran a saloon and gaming house that was to grow and prosper through the gold boom until it was the biggest place in town. He gave his golden gun to Wendy to put into her safe. A few months later, he'd heard news that Rebel Hawks was in New York and had set out down to cross the isthmus to go after him. Then he had been taken sick with the fever, during which time he'd gotten another message from Wendy, this time, that Rebel Hawks had come back to Frisco. He'd been wounded fatally in a gun battle but had gotten to Wendy Markham before he died and given her the other golden gun to put in her safe. When Humphrey Palm heard this, realizing that he, himself, was not going to live to get back to Frisco, he had summoned Rip Campbell, one man he figured he could trust, and told him the story. At the same time, he sent a message to Wendy, telling her that he was sending Rip, who knew the whole story, to help her. She needed a man to help her go after the buried gold, but Humphrey didn't want her to trust any of the gold-mad miners who hung out at the saloon. He wanted Rip to help her. And for his trouble, Rip was to get Rebel Hawks half of the buried bonanza. When Nick Rip finished telling his story, Wendy Markham nodded her head and got up from her desk. "That sounds like the straight of it. And I can understand how it would sound to you like the mouthings of a madman, but I'll get those golden guns of Rebel Hawks now and show you for a fact that Humphrey's story was true." Rip grinned. "If so, it was worth catching the malaria myself and going through everything I have to get here. I'd go through hell, its own self, I reckon, for $50,000 worth of gold nuggets." He watched the fat woman waddle over to the safe and squat down in front of it. He listened to the falling of tumblers sounding faintly in the quiet of the little office as she spun the combination. Finally, there was the squeaking of the heavy door of the safe as it swung open. When she stood up and turned around, Wendy Markham had a set of twin six-shooters by their long barrels, their golden butt grips glistening in the dull lamp glow. She walked over to Rip Campbell and handed them to him. "The sections of the map are hidden under the grip." Rip took the guns, went over to the desk under the lamp, and with his jackknife, quickly pried off the gold-plated grips. He stared down at them for a long time, then straightened up, frowning, the muscled ridge of his jaws tight. Through his teeth, he said, "There is nothing under these gun grips, nothing at all." "What the hell?" The giant saloon proprietress hurled herself across the office, fumbled at the guns with her fat fingers. "Gone," she kept saying. "They were there. I saw them. Now, they're gone. Somebody got to the guns and stole the pieces of the map. They've stolen our treasure, Rip." She reached out and gripped his arms with her fat, jeweled fingers, and the grip was almost as strong as a man's. She shook him. "You stupid string bean, you must have talked. You must have mentioned Humphrey's story to somebody, and they beat you here, broke in here, and somehow opened the safe and—" "Cut it." He stopped her. "That safe shows no signs of being forced open. Somebody used the combination. Who knows it, beside yourself?" She shook her head, standing there, dazed looking. "No one," she said, dully. "No one knows it. I don't see how." She broke off, the fat of her hooded eyes almost closing completely over them. "Unless it's Lily Bell. She's been in here when I've opened the safe. She could have watched or listened to the combination. It has to be her. It couldn't be anybody else." Almost before Wendy Markham finished speaking, Rip leapt toward the door, caught the knob in his big hand, and swung it open. Lily Bell stood there, her darkly pretty face looking pale and frightened, but determined. She held a derringer in her right hand, levelly. She said, "That's right, avant-garde. It was I who took the sections of the map from the golden guns of rebel hawks. And I'll tell you why. Because you lied in your teeth about rebel dying. You had him killed right here looking for Humphrey Palm, so that they could go back together to get their treasure and gold nuggets. And you thought it would be a good idea to have the whole thing. You." "The girl's gone loco," Wendy Markham interrupted. "Don't believe her, Rip." "Lily, how can you even say such a thing? You weren't even working for me when rebel hawks came back here." "I know that," Lily admitted. "I came here to find out what happened to Rebel." "Why?" Rip asked. "What was he to you?" "He was my father," she said, her breath catching a little in her throat. "All the time he was out here prospecting, he kept me in a school back east. When I didn't hear from him for months, I left the school and set out to look for him. I traced him as far as this saloon, and then when I couldn't seem to get any farther, I applied for a job with you, Miss Markham, under another name. Not long afterward, I happened to spot the golden guns in your safe and remembered my father showing them to me, once. One of the grips was loose where you'd pried it open before, and I saw part of the map sticking out. So I took both parts. I waited my time, then, to learn what had happened to my father. Tonight, eavesdropping on your conversation with Steve Jardine, I heard the story you told. I realized it wasn't the truth and figured out what really happened." "If you can prove that yarn, Lily," Rip said. "If you really are the daughter of rebel hawks, that means his share of the buried gold is yours. I reckon I'll have to just step out of the picture." "I can prove it all right," she said. "I." The rest of the sentence was cut off as Lily Hawks suddenly half-turned toward a sound in the hallway behind her. She was a second too late. A husky, hairy arm went around her throat from behind. Another arm knocked the derringer from her hand. The man who had grabbed Lily from behind now came into the angle of Rip Campbell's vision, past the door jamb. He was a squat, powerfully built, barrel-chested figure of a man, with huge, bunched shoulders and a bull neck. He had a leonine mane of shaggy blonde hair and thick, yellow brows over his deeply sunken green eyes. His mouth was big and loose and moist-looking. Most of the bones in his nose had been smashed so that it was twisted and spread half across his face. Over the top of Lily's dark head, as she struggled in vain to break free, the blond man showed a set of tobacco-stained and crooked teeth. "What's going on here, Miss Wendy? This little secretary of yours turning out to be a female bandit?" "No." Wendy Markham forced a husky laugh. "It's all right, Wes Conrad. Just a little personal trouble between the two of us. Now she's disarmed, maybe I can talk a little sense into her fool young head. Kick that derringer over here and then turn her loose." Wes Conrad did that, and Lily Hawks stepped away from him, rubbing her throat, patting loose curls of her hair back into place. Conrad just stood there, grinning wolfishly, looking first at Rip Campbell, then at Wendy Markham, with a curiously sly grin on his heavy-featured, stupid-looking face. He jerked his head at Rip. "This son giving you any trouble, Miss Wendy?" She shook her jowls impatiently. No, Wes. Everything's all right now. What was it you wanted?" He told her that there had been a dispute at the bar over the price of drinks, and one of the customers was demanding to see her. "Tell him I'm too busy right now," Wendy Markham said. "Settle the thing any way you want, Wes. You bartenders are in complete control of the bar when I'm not around. Now beat it. And don't disturb me again." She bent suddenly and picked up the little derringer Wes Conrad had kicked toward her. She pointed it at Lily. "You, honey, stay right here. We got some more palavering to do." She waited until Wes Conrad slammed the door shut behind him, then said, "All right, Lily. You must have the parts of the map. Let's have them." She waggled the derringer at Lily, menacingly. Lily looked frightened and undecided. Her long-lashed black eyes glanced fleetingly at Rip, as though for help or advice. Finally, he said, "Do as she says, kid. Like I told you before, you give us proof of being this rebel hawk's daughter and I'll see that you get your share." With that, Lily Hawks turned her back to them, hiked up her skirt, and fumbled about for a moment. When she straightened and turned around, she held two little slips of crumpled paper in her hand and a tiny gold locket. She walked over to Wendy Markham's desk and set them both down near the lamp. "There are the two sections of the map," she said, "and proof that I'm Lily Hawks." Still holding the derringer, Wendy Markham waddled over and picked up the pieces of paper, glanced at them quickly, and passed them over to Rip. Looking at the small, stained, and almost illegible scraps of paper, he saw that they showed a simply drawn map of a region called Red Rock Canyon. In small, cramped lettering, the instructions said, 2 miles inside Red Rock Canyon find Teepee Rock. Stand on rock at 10 forenoon and walk where shadow falls 100 paces and start digging. The locket that Rip held showed a small picture of a long-faced man, with slanting eyebrows and a sharply hooked nose and a widow's peak over his forehead. On the back of the locket were inscribed the words, "To my daughter Lily, from her loving father, John M. Hawks." Rip said to Wendy Markham, "This seems to do it. The gal's claim seems legit. What happens now?" Wendy Markham tapped the long gold cigarette holder against her dumpling fat cheeks for a moment, then said, "Tomorrow morning, we'll all set out for Red Rock Canyon and dig up the hidden gold. We'll pack it back into town on some extra burros and split the take 3 ways. Fair enough?" Rip looked at Lily, and she nodded imperceptibly. He shrugged. 2 women against 1 poor man, he said, grinning. "I reckon it's settled no matter what I say." They talked for a while longer, making their plans for the morning, and as they talked, their excitement mounted. When Rip finally left them to return to his hotel, he lay on his iron slat bed in the small room for long hours, unable to get to sleep. He kept thinking about all that had happened since that first night down on the isthmus when he'd met Humphrey Palm. He kept thinking about the girl, Lily Hawks, and how if they pooled their shares of the gold together, it would make a right nice sum, enough for a couple to buy a fine spread somewhere. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't getting any younger and that the roaming life he'd been leading was beginning to pall. He wondered how it would be to settle down somewhere for good, with a girl like the Lily. It was on that pleasant thought that Rip Campbell went to sleep. The next morning he felt more refreshed and physically fit than he had since before he'd been struck down with the fever in Panama. He didn't know whether it was at the prospect of seeing Lily Hawks again or because of the excitement of going after the hidden gold treasure of a couple of old prospectors who had struck it rich. He shaved and dressed, left the hotel, and purchased a brace of 6 guns from the local gunsmith to fill his empty holsters and met Lily and Wendy Markham at the appointed time in front of the avant-garde's place. They were already waiting for him, mounted on pack mules, with an extra mount for him and 2 others to pack back the gold nuggets. Even in the bright morning sun, Lily Hawks looked pretty, he noticed. Her dark eyes were fresh and clear-looking. And even the simple lines of the blue work shirt and Levi's she wore couldn't hide the gently curved richness of her figure. The bright sunlight didn't do so well by Wendy Markham. The older woman's red hair was tucked up under a large Stetson. Her huge, dumpy figure was tightly encased in a corduroy jacket and trousers tucked into the tops of hobbled boots. Her face looked puffy and tired, the heavy dewlaps of unhealthy-looking flesh around her jaws a pasty white. Without her makeup and flashing jewels, without the bright background of her noisy saloon and gaming hall, in the cruel light of day, Wendy Markham was just a too fat, tired old woman, with the taint of dissipation and a suggestion of evil in her ugly, fatty face. As they rode out of town, Rip Campbell couldn't help remembering Lily's accusation that Wendy Markham had murdered Rebel Hawks in order to have his share of the treasure. If that was true, he couldn't understand the woman saloon keeper agreeing so readily to sharing the gold with both of them. A strange feeling of uneasiness beset him as they rode farther away from town and into the shadows of the distant mountains. This increased as Wendy became grim-faced and grouchy to a greater extent than the discomfort of the ride warranted. But as they rode the burros into the deep cut in the foothills known as Red Rock Canyon, Rip slowly forgot his fears in the excitement and suspense of wondering whether or not they would find the buried treasure. He had lived with the fanciful tale he'd heard from old Humphrey Palm so long, had wondered about its authenticity so many times that it had become like a dream. It was hard to believe that at last he was going to learn the final truth of it. They reached the huge wigwam-shaped hunk of stone, setting in the middle of the dried-up riverbed at the bottom of the canyon, that was known as Teepee Rock, a few minutes before 10 o'clock. On the way out, they'd passed many of the snake-roofed cabins and long tom's looses of miners, but here in Red Rock Canyon, there was no sign of any of the thousands of men who had come to the area from all parts of the world to try their luck in prying some of Mother Earth's riches from her lap. Here there was nothing but the solemn quiet of the wilderness place, with a lone hawk swooping and circling in the bright blue of the morning sky over the canyon. It was, Rip Campbell observed, an excellent spot that the 2 old grubstakers had picked to bury their treasure. At the exact time mentioned on the map, Rip climbed Teepee Rock. Wendy Markham then paced off the distance and stood on the spot, while Rip clambered down off the rock and with the help of Lily Hawks, drove the burros toward Wendy. For a moment, they all stood there, looking down at the rocky, grave-strewn ground beneath them, a little awed. There was no indication that a fortune in yellow gold nuggets was buried there beneath their feet. Suddenly Wendy Markham laughed, raspingly. She said, "This is the way to mine. You don't waste a lifetime looking. You don't break your back and sweat yourself to death digging and digging for nothing. We know the gold is here. We dig for a little while and there it is." Rip Campbell didn't say anything. He didn't remind the woman that what she said was true, but only because her husband, who was now dead, and his partner, Lily's father, had spent probably the best part of their life in that back-breaking, sweating job. He didn't remind Wendy Markham of that because she wouldn't have paid any attention. She would have laughed at him. She had only one thought in her mind now. There was the crazy, familiar glitter in her rheumy old eyes that he had come to recognize. The gold fever was upon her, as burning hot as though she had actually been mining herself and was on the verge of a big strike. Rip unpacked the tools from one of the burrows and went to work, using a pickaxe and shovel. He dug a hole almost 3 feet square and of equal depth before he finally stopped and leaned on the spade, sweat running into his eyes and coursing through the dirt and beard on his cheeks. He said through his teeth, "Something's wrong, somewhere. It isn't here." So Rip climbed up out of the hole he'd dug and started in a new place right next to it. This time, he dug down 6 inches, the pick made a ringing sound as it struck metal. He went to work with a fury, then, ignoring the aching of his back muscles and biceps. In a few minutes, he had bared the top of a huge metal box. By now, both women were standing at the edge of the pit and were egging him on. When he had gotten the first metal box completely unearthed, they helped him lift it out of the hole. With the pick point, he pried off the lid. It was filled with gold nuggets. While the women loaded the contents of the first box into the burrow packs, Rip Campbell dug up 2 more. It was an hour later before all the nuggets were stowed away inside the meal packs. Rip, now that the excitement was beginning to wear off, felt weary and beat out. He stood swaying for a moment, in the hot sun, the hard labor that he had put in the past couple of hours beginning to take its toll on his fever-weakened body. But he managed to grin as he said, "Maybe Humphrey Palm and Rebel Hawks can rest in their graves now. Rebel's golden guns have done their jobs. The treasure is found. Let's strike back for town." He started toward the spot near Wendy Markham, where he had stripped off his cartridge belt and gun-filled holsters. He saw Wendy suddenly bend and pick them up and held out his hand as he walked toward her, figuring that she was going to hand them to him. But then he stopped short, realizing that he had figured wrong. Wendy Markham wasn't handing his gun gear to him. She was pulling the brace of 6 guns from their leather. She dropped the cartridge belt. She held the guns toward him, "All right, but it was barrel first," she said, her full lips curving at one corner in a sneer. "Stand, Rip. You ain't going back to town. This is the end of the trail for you, mister." Lily Hawks cried, "What's going on? What's the idea, Miss Markham?" B swung one of the 6 guns toward her, covering her. "You do, dearie," she said. Her pale, flabby face, beaded with sweat now, formed a mask of a grin. "You two didn't really think I was going to split this haul of gold nuggets with you, did you? So you're giving us a double deal?" Rip said. "Not exactly. You forget, handsome, that my dear, departed husband was the one who made this strike. I only needed your help to get it up out of the ground." "You're forgetting a man named Rebel Hawks, Humphrey's partner," Rip reminded her. "Cut me out of it, if you will, ma'am, but give the kid, here, a break." He jerked his head at Lily. Wendy Markham laughed, her flabby, drooping jowls dancing merrily. "Such sentiment," she snorted. "Humphrey picked the right man all right. An honest, sentimental fool. Well, in a moment, you'll see what honesty and sentiment get a person. When you're lying here, rotting and the buzzards are swooping down to peck out your eyeballs." Rip felt the hackles along the nape of his neck begin to rise. This woman who had gotten the drop on him didn't have a scruple in her gross body. There was now no doubt in his mind but what she really meant to kill him and Lily both. He half made a move toward rushing her but brought himself up short as the gun stiffened in her fists, her plump white forefinger tightening on the triggers. In desperation, he asked, "Don't you have enough dinero, Wendy? You must make a fortune out of that place you run. What good is it going to do you to commit double murder just for a few more $1,000s?" She grinned at him. "I never get enough money, Rip," she told him. "I reckon it gets to be like a sickness after a while. You get so you want more and more, and it isn't going to be double murder, it'll be triple." The kid was right. I did do in her old man, Rebel Hawks. He, too, was a trusting, stupid fool. A little cry came from Lily, then. Looking toward her, Rip saw that her cheeks were stained with the red of rage. Her tiny fists were clenched at her sides. She started a blind rush at the older woman, screaming, "You fat, lying murderous old witch, I never had any real proof that you killed my father, but now that I know for certain, I'm going to get you for it. I swore that I would." Rip cut her off. He yelled, "Wait, Lily. Don't be loco. She'll gun you down. You haven't a chance that way. We might not be able to reason with her." But Lily Hawk's anger and frustration were too great. She paid no heed to Rip's warning but kept on with her headlong rush toward B. Markham. Cursing, Jardine started a desperate, last-minute leap, as he saw Wendy's trigger finger on the gun pointing at Lily began to squeeze. A second later there was the flat clap sound of a gunshot echoing back and forth between the walls of the canyon, and Rip stopped his leap to save Lily from Wendy Markham's guns. He saw Lily stop, too. He waited to watch her fall, but she didn't. She kept standing there, staring in surprise at Wendy. And then Rip noticed a curious thing. No smoke was trickling from the muzzle of the gun that Wendy held. The next instant, he noticed that the big female saloon keeper was no longer looking at either he or Lily. She was staring into space between them. And then both 6 guns held in her fists began to droop, barrel down. When they had dropped back down to her sides, her fat fingers slowly opened, and the weapons clattered to the ground. Then Wendy Markham started walking toward them. She took 3 steps and her legs went out from under her. She murmured, I've been double-crossed. We're being dry-gulched. The words stopped as a sudden froth of blood appeared on her full lips. Her eyes rolled wildly back into her head, and she pitched headlong to the ground. Rip saw the tiny black bullet hole in the back of her corduroy jacket at the same time that another rifle shot echoed from back up the canyon. This time, the bullet went screaming over their heads, hit a jut rock, and ricocheted off in another direction, whining its deadly song. He threw himself at Lily and pulled her down to the ground with him. He crawled swiftly toward the fallen figure of Wendy Markham and scooped up his own 6 guns from where she had dropped them. Next, he crawled over to his cartridge belt and got that. Meanwhile, his eyes had been searching along the top of the canyon walls, and he saw a flash of flame and a puff of smoke from a clump of sugar pines on the rimrock. A moment later, a few hundred yards farther on, another rifle shot burst forth. As he crawled back, hugging flat to the rock-strewn earth, there were 2 more shots, from different spots along the edge of the cliffs. He took Lily by the hand, and the 2 of them squirmed along the ground until they reached the temporary shelter of a clump of rocks. Settled there, Rip watched the places where the first shots had come from, and when he saw a sudden movement, he raised up on both elbows and blazed away with one gun, emptying it. He saw a man stop short on the edge of an abutment, flinging his arms into the air and slowly tumble over the edge, his body arcing out into space, the ringing sound of his scream of anguish, a soul-chilling thing, as it echoed up and down the hollow canyon. For a moment after that, there was nothing but silence. "Who is it?" Lily wondered, tremulously, reloading the empty 6-gun Rip handed to her. "Somebody must have followed us, or after the gold." "Reckon so," Rip agreed dryly. "And I got an idea it's that hulking blonde barkeep of Wendy's, the man who butted into our conference yesterday, the man she called Wes Conrad. He must have overheard part of the conversation, learned what we were up to, and followed us out here, with a couple of his cronies, this morning." "That must be it," Lily said. "Nobody else could know. And we left town this morning before anybody else was up, hardly." As if in answer to their wondering, a deep voice suddenly rang out. It said, "You might as well throw out your irons and come out into the open with your hands raised. We still outnumber you, 3-2. "It's Wes Conrad, all right," Lily told Rip. "I recognize his voice. And that must be Sid Bogart, Cal McMasters, and Wick Rogers, with him. Those 4 have always hung out together. Wes is a bartender at Wendy's place and the other 3 work there as bouncers. They're a tough crew, Nick. Maybe we'd better do as they say." "We wouldn't stand a chance," he growled back. "They'd gun us down, pronto. No, kid, our only chance is to fight 'em off, or die tryin'." With that, he raised one of his guns and pumped 2 shots in the direction of the voice. There was a muffled oath from one of the hiding spots on the cliff and then 2 more rifle shots whipped down at them. A slug whipped up gravel next to Rip's face, where he was sprawled on the ground. He found Lily hug up closer to him. For several minutes, then, there were no more shots. Rip, watching the place on the canyon cliffs from where they were being ambushed, saw a stooped figure scurry out from behind a rock. He snapped a quick shot but saw the bent figure keep going and knew that he had missed. He kept watching and saw that same shadowy figure emerge in the clear for a flashing moment again, but not long enough for him to get in a shot. "We're liable to be in real hot water, soon, honey," he whispered to Lily. One of them made a break. "The way he's moving, it looks as though he's aiming to get behind us. We'll be caught in a crossfire, then. We'll have protection on only one side. I think I got another one of them before. If so, that leaves only 2 against 2. But we're still at a disadvantage because they're up high and with more cover. We're stuck down here where they can pot at us from any angle. Isn't there something I can do to help, Nick?" she begged. He turned around and looked at her. Her face was very close to his, and he saw no fear in her dark eyes. Serious concern, yes, but none of the panic and terror that some women would show in similar circumstances. Her little jaw was as set and determined as his own. She looked like the most beautiful thing in the world to Rip Campbell at that moment. "Lily," he suddenly blurted. "This is going to sound loco as all hell to you. I done in whether everything that's happened has made me blow all my buttons or whether it's the fever coming back on me. Anyhow, every time I look at you I get weak and dizzy. I reckon I'm just plumb off my rocker over you, Lily. I want to tell you right now, in case we never get out of this tight. You understand, Lily?" She nodded. The ghost of a smile played about her young lips. Her eyes moved over his face like a caress. "I understand, Nick," she said, levelly. Her hand caught his wrist and squeezed it tightly. To cover up the sudden surge of emotion that ran through him, Nick said, "Now, we've got to outfox these pirate and coyotes up there on the Rimrock. We can't let them get us between a crossfire. There's only one thing to do." He handed one of the 6 guns to Lily, along with a few extra cartridges. "The way we're set up behind this rock, that hombre up yonder, in front of us, can't see us if we stay in a line with this rock. You're going to sit here and keep potting away at him. I'm going to move back, keeping in line with this rock and meet that skunk who's trying to get into position behind us, halfway. It's our only chance." "All right, Nick," she breathed. Her hand squeezed his arm again. "Be careful. Please, Nick." Sure, I will," he told her. He bent his head and let his lips brush hers in a quick, impetuous kiss, and then he started to edge off backward, away from her, always crouched, and keeping the rock in the line of vision between himself and the Alhoot up front. It took him a long time, and every once in a while, he heard a rifle slug go whistling down the canyon toward the rock where Lily was. For an instant, his heart would stop 50 cold, fearing that she had been hit. But then he would hear the answering shot of his own 6-gun and knew that she was still all right. He would move on. At length, he reached another cluster of rocks, near the base of the canyon wall. Once behind this, he was able to stand erect, without being seen, and make a wild dash into a deep crevice. There were foot and handholds up the side of the crevice that helped him to climb swiftly and surely. He kept going until he felt that he was at a point where he was above the man trying to sneak up on their rear. He waited a moment, getting his breath and his bearings. And then he spotted the other man, off to his left and below him about 100 feet. The man was setting himself up, bracing himself on a narrow shelf of rock, in a perfect position to gun down on Lily, far below, lying prone behind her rock protection. He would only need one shot, Rip knew, he wouldn't miss. Finally, Nick made a ledge about 10 feet above the tall man. Just as the other was sighting along the long barrel of the rifle, Rip leapt. He hurtled down and landed full on the back of the outlaw. The other's rifle went skittering off the edge of the cliff into space, clanged to the bottom, several hundred feet below, and went off with a sharp crack of sound. The man screamed as Rip landed, but Nick clung tight with both knees, belabored the other man's neck and the back of his head with his fists. For a few moments, they wrestled back and forth perilously close to the edge of that tiny shelf of rock, first one on top, then the other. After a few moments, both squirmed free from the other and climbed to his feet. They faced each other there, with barely 3 inches between themselves and the sheer drop to the rocky floor of the canyon below. The outlaw was wild-eyed and slobbering with fear and anger now. A steady stream of oaths poured from his curled lips as he swung a murderous blow at Rip's head. Rip ducked at the last moment, and the fist rifled through his hair, hitting against the rock behind Rip. Then he feinted with his left, turning away the other man's guard. He brought his right fist up from his boot tops. It had all the weight of his 180 rangy pounds behind it. It landed on the other man's lantern jaw with a sickening thwack sound. The outlaw was raised clear off his feet. He sunfished backward and out into space. He was out cold from the punch and didn't utter a sound, but Rip could hear his body bouncing off the rock, all the way down. He stood there, getting his breath back, trembling for a moment. And then he heard a shot from the other point of ambush and quickly turned his eyes down to the place behind the rock where Lily was hiding. He saw her prone figure jerk, and then, as he watched, she got up onto her hands and knees, one hand pressed to the side of her head. She half rose up to her feet and then fell headlong. He stood there, horrified, a numbed feeling spreading through him as he looked down at that still figure behind the rock, far below, its arms outspread, the six-gun no longer clutched in the small fingers. And then he saw another thing. Wes Conrad, who had shot Lily, had witnessed his hit. He had broken out into the open now, convinced, apparently, that Rip had been taken care of by his partner, and knowing that he was safe from Lily. Rip watched him scrambling down the side of the canyon wall. He realized that if Lily was only wounded, if she wasn't yet dead, Wes Conrad would finish her off. With a little cry, Rip turned back the way he had come. He retrieved his six-gun from the place where it had fallen, in his mad ascent before. He jammed it into his belt and started a swift, crazy climb down the side of the cliff again. He reached the bottom about the same time that Wes Conrad did. Both men started their mad sprint toward Lily, almost simultaneously. It was a race for life. Halfway to their goal, both men seemed to realize that the race was going to end in a dead heat. They both stopped at the same time, setting themselves, bracing their feet apart, whipping up their irons. They stood there, 100 yards apart, with Lily's prone figure between them, like two men in a formal duel, only there were no witnesses here, no formalities. There would be no medical attention for the one who lost. Almost as one sound, both six guns barked against the wild silence of the lonely canyon. Rip Campbell felt something tug at the shoulder of his jacket, felt a warm wetness running down his arm. But through the cordite-reeking gunsmoke, he stared, cold-eyed toward Wes Conrad. He saw the short, powerfully built barkeep, his thick mane of yellow hair gleaming in the sun, folding, slowly, both hands clutching at his middle. Slowly, every muscle aching, almost dizzy with weariness, Rip started again toward Lily. He stepped over the twisted still heap that was Conrad. He reached Lily, knelt beside her, his heart thundering. He kept saying, "You can't die, honey. Not now. Not when everything's over and all right at last." And then his heart went to leaping wildly inside the cave of his ribs, as he saw her head turn. Her long tangled black lashes flickered for an instant, and then those dark eyes were looking up at him dazedly. He saw then, dabbing, with the sleeve of his jacket at the little streak of blood there, that the bullet had only grazed her temple. He said a little prayer of thanks and held her head in his arms for a moment. He helped her to her feet a moment later, and she stood there, dizzily, leaning against him. Then, slowly, quietly, they started to walk down the canyon toward the tethered burros, their arms around each other. The sun was warm upon them. High above them, a crow whirled and caught at them. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Rip Campbell felt a strange, pleasant peaceful glow of happiness spreading within him. He glanced up at the blue sky and softly said, "Well, Lily, it looks as though Rebel's golden guns are going to bring happiness to someone, at last." "Yes," she whispered back and held his arm very tightly, and he knew that she knew what he had meant and that everything was going to be fine between them. The end.